Hay algo que casi nadie dice en voz alta. No es la juventud lo que vuelve a alguien atractivo, sino la forma en que su mente ha aprendido a comunicarse con el mundo. Y aquí viene lo incómodo. Muchas frases que dicen los hombres mayores no son mágicas por las palabras en sí, sino por lo que transmiten psicológicamente: seguridad, calma y experiencia emocional. Mientras los jóvenes intentan impresionar, algunos hombres mayores simplemente hablan, y eso, paradójicamente, resulta mucho más atractivo. Cuando hablamos de por qué ciertas formas de comunicación de los hombres mayores resultan más atractivas para algunas mujeres, el primer factor psicológico clave tiene que ver con la seguridad emocional que se percibe a través de la calma. No se trata únicamente de la edad biológica, sino de cómo la experiencia vital transforma la manera en que una persona se expresa. Un hombre mayor, en muchos casos, ha atravesado suficientes situaciones de presión, fracaso, pérdida o incertidumbre como para aprender a regular su reacción emocional. Esa regulación se refleja directamente en su forma de hablar, en su ritmo, en su tono y en la ausencia de urgencia emocional en sus palabras. Desde la psicología, el cerebro humano está constantemente evaluando señales de seguridad o peligro en el entorno social. Esto no ocurre de manera consciente la mayor parte del tiempo, sino como un proceso automático. Cuando una persona habla con calma, sin interrupciones nerviosas, sin necesidad de justificar cada frase o buscar aprobación inmediata, el oyente interpreta inconscientemente que esa persona tiene control interno. Ese control no es percibido como frialdad, sino como estabilidad. Y la estabilidad emocional es uno de los factores más importantes en la atracción interpersonal a largo plazo, porque el cerebro la asocia con protección, previsibilidad y ausencia de amenaza. En contraste, cuando alguien habla con ansiedad, prisa o necesidad constante de validación, el sistema emocional del oyente detecta una especie de inestabilidad. No importa cuán atractivas sean las palabras, el subtexto emocional transmite inseguridad, y la inseguridad, a nivel psicológico, activa una ligera alerta interna. No es que genere rechazo inmediato, pero sí reduce la sensación de confort. Por eso, la calma se vuelve un factor tan poderoso. No compite con las palabras, sino que las refuerza. En el caso de los hombres mayores, esa calma suele manifestarse en frases simples, pausadas y directas. No sienten la necesidad de llenar silencios con explicaciones excesivas ni de impresionar con complejidad verbal. Esto crea un efecto interesante. Cuanto menos esfuerzo parece haber en la comunicación, más auténtica se percibe. El cerebro humano tiende a interpretar la naturalidad como sinceridad, y la sinceridad, a su vez, fortalece la percepción de confianza. Además, la calma en la comunicación transmite algo más profundo, la idea de que esa persona no depende emocionalmente de la reacción del otro, es decir, no está hablando para obtener aprobación inmediata, sino para expresar un pensamiento ya consolidado internamente. Esta independencia emocional es interpretada como madurez, y la madurez, en contextos de relaciones humanas, se asocia con estabilidad de pareja, capacidad de resolver conflictos y baja probabilidad de comportamiento impulsivo. También hay un componente biológico detrás de esta percepción. El sistema nervioso humano responde a la voz y al ritmo del habla como indicadores de estado emocional. Un ritmo lento y controlado puede activar respuestas parasimpáticas en el oyente, generando una sensación de relajación. Esa relajación crea un vínculo inconsciente entre la presencia de la otra persona y la sensación de bienestar. Por eso, la calma no solo se entiende mentalmente, sino que también se siente físicamente. En conjunto, todo esto hace que la seguridad emocional transmitida por la calma no sea un detalle superficial, sino un elemento central en la percepción de atractivo. No es la edad lo que genera atracción, sino la manera en que la experiencia ha moldeado una comunicación sin ansiedad, sin necesidad de demostrar nada y con una estabilidad que el cerebro humano reconoce como confiable y atractiva. Otro factor psicológico importante en la percepción de atractivo en la comunicación de algunos hombres mayores es la confianza que no depende de la aprobación externa. Este tipo de confianza no se construye a partir de frases llamativas o intentos de impresionar, sino de una postura interna que ya no necesita ser validada constantemente por los demás. A nivel psicológico, esto se expresa en la forma en que una persona afirma sus ideas, toma decisiones y sostiene su discurso sin buscar confirmación emocional en cada interacción. Cuando un hombre joven habla, es común que en su comunicación aparezca, de manera consciente o inconsciente, una búsqueda de aceptación. Esto puede manifestarse en preguntas indirectas, en justificar excesivamente lo que dice o en ajustar su opinión dependiendo de la reacción del otro. No es algo negativo en sí mismo, pero desde la perspectiva de la psicología social, esta necesidad de validación transmite una sensación de dependencia emocional, y la dependencia emocional tiende a reducir la percepción de liderazgo y seguridad en el otro. En cambio, cuando una persona habla desde una posición de experiencia, su lenguaje suele ser más afirmativo. Frases como expresar una idea sin rodeos, sostener una opinión sin disculparse por ella o compartir una conclusión basada en vivencias previas generan una impresión de solidez interna. El cerebro humano interpreta esta solidez como una señal de competencia y estabilidad, y estas dos cualidades están estrechamente ligadas a la confianza percibida. Lo interesante es que esta confianza no necesita ser dominante ni agresiva. No se trata de imponer opiniones o de invalidar a los demás, sino de no depender de la reacción externa para sostener lo que uno piensa. Esa ausencia de necesidad crea un efecto psicológico poderoso. La otra persona siente que está frente a alguien que no está buscando algo desesperadamente, lo cual reduce la presión emocional en la interacción. Y cuando la presión baja, aumenta la comodidad, lo que a su vez incrementa la atracción. Desde la neuropsicología, el cerebro humano está diseñado para detectar intenciones detrás del comportamiento social. Cuando percibe que alguien está intentando gustar a toda costa, se activa una lectura de estrategia social, lo que reduce la espontaneidad del vínculo. Sin embargo, cuando percibe que alguien simplemente expresa su realidad sin necesidad de aprobación, se activa una interpretación de autenticidad. Y la autenticidad es un rasgo altamente valorado en la construcción de confianza interpersonal. Además, esta confianza sin búsqueda de aprobación suele venir acompañada de una mayor coherencia entre lo que se dice y lo que se hace. Con el tiempo y la experiencia, las personas tienden a ajustar su comunicación para que refleje mejor su realidad interna. Esto genera una alineación entre pensamiento, palabra y acción, lo cual refuerza aún más la percepción de integridad, y la integridad es una de las bases psicológicas más fuertes de la atracción basada en respeto. También hay un efecto sutil pero importante. Cuando alguien no necesita aprobación, deja más espacio emocional al otro, no invade la conversación con ansiedad, no interrumpe con inseguridad y no monopoliza la interacción con dudas constantes. Este espacio crea una sensación de libertad psicológica en la otra persona, lo cual aumenta la comodidad y la conexión. En conjunto, la confianza sin necesidad de validación externa no es simplemente un estilo de hablar, sino una señal profunda de autonomía emocional. Y esa autonomía es interpretada por el cerebro humano como una forma de fuerza tranquila, que no exige atención, pero que naturalmente la atrae. Another important psychological reason why certain communication styles of older men can feel more attractive is the presence of emotional maturity expressed through simplicity. This is not about using fewer words in a literal sense, but about removing emotional noise from communication. Emotional noise includes exaggeration, over explaining, unnecessary drama, defensive language, or the need to constantly justify one's feelings. With life experience, many people gradually learn to filter this noise out, and what remains is a clearer, more grounded way of speaking. From a psychological perspective, emotional maturity is closely linked to self regulation. This means the ability to experience emotions without being controlled by them in the moment of expression. When someone has not yet developed this regulation, their communication tends to reflect emotional fluctuations very strongly. They might overreact verbally, add intensity to their statements, or shift quickly between emotional extremes in conversation. While this can feel engaging at times, it can also create a sense of unpredictability in social interaction. In contrast, a more mature communicator tends to simplify emotional expression without suppressing it. They do not need to amplify their feelings to make them valid, nor do they need to defend every emotional reaction. Instead, they communicate in a more direct and grounded way. This creates a sense of clarity in interaction. The listener does not have to decode hidden emotional layers or navigate unpredictable shifts in tone. The message is easier to process, and this cognitive ease is psychologically important because the brain naturally prefers information that requires less effort to interpret. This simplicity is often misinterpreted as emotional distance, but in psychological terms, it is more accurately described as emotional efficiency. The person is not removing emotion, they are refining how it is expressed. Instead of saying too much, they choose words that reflect a more stable internal state. This is why phrases from emotionally mature individuals often feel calm, structured, and intentional rather than reactive or chaotic. There is also a strong connection between emotional simplicity and perceived reliability. When someone consistently communicates without unnecessary emotional escalation, the listener begins to form an expectation of stability. This predictability is comforting because it reduces uncertainty in social interactions. Human beings are naturally drawn to environments where emotional outcomes feel more understandable and less volatile. In relationships, this becomes especially important because emotional unpredictability can create tension over time. Older men, due to accumulated life experience, often refine their communication style by removing unnecessary emotional complexity. They learn that not every feeling needs to be expressed in its most intense form, and not every situation requires a strong emotional reaction. This does not mean they feel less. Rather, they express themselves in a more controlled and selective way. This selectivity creates a sense of internal order, which is perceived by others as emotional strength. Another subtle psychological effect of this simplicity is that it reduces social pressure in conversation. When someone does not overcomplicate their emotional expression, the other person feels less pressure to respond perfectly or manage intense emotional expectations. This creates a more relaxed interactional space where communication flows more naturally. In such environments, attraction can develop more easily because the nervous system is not under stress. Ultimately, emotional maturity expressed through simplicity is powerful because it signals internal organization. It shows that a person is not overwhelmed by their own emotions and does not need to project them outward in exaggerated ways. This creates a sense of emotional safety, clarity, and steadiness that the human mind naturally associates with trustworthiness and long term relational stability. Another psychological factor that influences attraction in communication is the way leadership is subtly expressed through language. This is not about dominance, control, or giving orders in an authoritarian way. Instead, it is about a calm form of direction that signals clarity, experience, and the ability to make decisions without hesitation. In many cases, older men develop a communication style that naturally shifts from uncertainty to orientation. Rather than asking what should be done at every step, they tend to propose paths, structure options, and guide situations with quiet confidence. From a psychological standpoint, human beings are highly sensitive to cues of leadership because leadership historically meant safety, organization, and survival in group settings. Even in modern social interactions, the brain still responds to these cues. When someone communicates with clarity and direction, it reduces cognitive load for the listener. Instead of having to figure out what to do or how to interpret ambiguity, the listener is given a clear framework. This reduction in mental effort creates a sense of relief and trust. In contrast, communication that is filled with hesitation, excessive questioning, or constant doubt can create subtle discomfort, not because questioning is negative, but because it signals lack of internal structure. When someone repeatedly defers decisions or avoids offering direction, the interaction can feel unstable or uncertain. Over time, this can reduce the perception of reliability. Leadership communication, on the other hand, does the opposite. It organizes uncertainty into clarity. Older men often express this leadership style through simple, structured statements rather than emotionally charged persuasion. For example, instead of trying to convince through intensity, they may offer practical guidance based on experience. This type of communication carries weight not because it is forceful, but because it feels grounded. The listener senses that the statement comes from repeated exposure to real situations rather than theoretical thinking. Psychologically, this creates what can be called cognitive anchoring. When a person speaks with clarity and direction, their words become a reference point in the listener's mind. Even if the listener does not fully agree, the structured nature of the communication makes it easier to consider and evaluate the idea. This anchoring effect is one of the reasons leadership oriented speech can feel attractive. It organizes complexity in a way that feels mentally efficient. Another important aspect is that effective leadership communication does not overwhelm others with unnecessary control. Instead, it balances direction with respect for autonomy. Phrases that suggest pathways rather than impose commands create a sense of collaboration rather than domination. This balance is crucial because it allows the listener to feel both guided and free at the same time. Psychologically, this combination is very powerful, as it satisfies both the need for security and the need for independence. With experience, many older individuals refine their language to naturally adopt this balanced leadership tone. They no longer feel the need to prove authority. Instead, they express it through calm suggestions, structured reasoning, and confidence in decision making. This absence of effort makes the leadership feel more authentic. The brain tends to interpret effortless clarity as a sign of genuine competence. In social and relational contexts, this type of communication can increase perceived attractiveness because it reduces uncertainty and increases trust. People are generally drawn to those who can simplify confusion without creating pressure. Leadership expressed through calm language achieves exactly that. It provides direction without emotional tension. Ultimately, this form of communication is powerful because it signals not only intelligence or experience, but also emotional control and situational awareness. It creates a perception of someone who can navigate complexity without being overwhelmed by it. And in human psychology, that combination of clarity, calmness, and guidance is often interpreted as deeply reliable and naturally appealing. Another key psychological factor behind the perceived attractiveness of some older men's communication style is the reduced need for emotional validation or approval from others. This is closely linked to emotional independence, which develops when a person becomes less dependent on external feedback to feel stable, worthy, or confident. With age and experience, many individuals gradually shift from seeking constant reassurance to relying more on their internal sense of self. This transformation has a direct impact on how they speak, interact, and emotionally position themselves in conversations. From a psychological perspective, human beings are highly sensitive to neediness signals in social interaction. These signals are not always obvious, but the brain can detect them through tone, timing, and conversational behavior. When someone constantly seeks agreement, reassurance, or approval, it can create a subtle sense of emotional pressure in the interaction. Even if the content of their speech is positive, the underlying need for validation can make the communication feel heavier or less relaxed. This is because the listener may unconsciously feel responsible for managing the other person's emotional state. In contrast, when a person does not display this need for constant validation, the interaction feels lighter and more balanced. Older men, particularly those who have developed emotional resilience through life experience, often communicate from a place where their sense of self is already internally established. They are not speaking to earn approval, they are speaking to express, share, or inform. This subtle difference dramatically changes how their words are received. Psychologically, this creates a perception of emotional self sufficiency, and self sufficiency is often associated with strength, stability, and maturity. When someone does not appear emotionally dependent on the reaction of others, they are perceived as having a stronger internal structure. This reduces interpersonal tension because the listener does not feel pressured to respond in a specific way. Instead, the interaction becomes more open ended and natural. Another important element is the concept of emotional space. When a person is not constantly seeking validation, they unconsciously allow more space for the other person's thoughts, reactions, and individuality. This creates a balanced dynamic where communication is not dominated by emotional demands. The absence of pressure allows the listener to engage more freely, which enhances comfort and often increases attraction. There is also a deeper neurological aspect to this. The human brain is wired to prefer interactions that feel predictable and non demanding. When someone does not require constant reassurance, the nervous system perceives the interaction as safer and less taxing. This reduces cognitive and emotional load, making the experience more pleasant. Over time, the brain begins to associate that person's presence with ease rather than stress. In older men, this reduced need for validation is often reflected in how they respond to disagreement or silence. Instead of over explaining or trying to immediately correct perceptions, they tend to remain composed and grounded. This composure signals that their emotional state is not dependent on immediate acceptance. As a result, their communication carries an undercurrent of stability that feels reassuring to others. Importantly, this emotional independence is not about indifference or lack of interest. It is about being complete within oneself while still engaging socially. That distinction is crucial. Indifference pushes people away, But emotional completeness creates attraction because it suggests inner balance. Ultimately, the reduced need for emotional validation makes communication feel cleaner, calmer, and more intentional. It removes hidden pressure from interactions and replaces it with a sense of freedom. And in human psychology, freedom within interaction is one of the conditions that most strongly supports comfort, trust, and attraction. Another important psychological reason why the communication style of some older men can feel more persuasive or attractive is the way experience reshapes the source of their words. Over time, people accumulate real life situations, successes, failures, relationships, conflicts, and lessons that gradually refine how they interpret the world. This accumulated experience changes not only what they say, but also the weight and tone behind their speech. As a result, their communication often shifts from theoretical opinions to grounded conclusions based on lived reality. From a psychological perspective, humans are naturally inclined to trust information that is rooted in experience rather than speculation. This is because lived experience carries an implicit form of verification. When someone says, I think this might work, the brain processes it as uncertain. But when someone says, I've seen this happen many times, and this is how it usually turns out, the brain interprets it as evidence based input. This difference significantly affects credibility and perceived authority. Older men, by virtue of having encountered more repeated life patterns, often communicate in a way that reflects this experiential certainty. Their statements tend to be less exploratory and more conclusive. This does not mean they are always right, but rather that their communication style reflects a history of observation and learning. Psychologically, this creates a sense of reliability because the listener assumes that the speaker is drawing from multiple real world references rather than a single idea or assumption. Another important element is cognitive efficiency. When communication is based on experience, it often becomes more concise and structured. Experienced individuals tend to filter out unnecessary details and focus on what actually matters. This makes their speech easier for the listener to process. The brain prefers information that is organized and reduces uncertainty, and experience based communication naturally provides that structure. It eliminates ambiguity by offering patterns instead of scattered opinions. There is also a strong psychological principle called social proof, which plays a role here. When someone indicates that they have repeatedly observed a situation in real life, the listener subconsciously treats this as a form of indirect validation. It is not just one person's opinion, it is a summary of many past experiences. This increases persuasive power without requiring emotional intensity or forceful argumentation. The authority comes from repetition and exposure rather than effort. Vamos a entender por qué.